She can't hear you, stop pretending, the billionaire snapped, his voice slicing through the diner's morning hush. The shy waitress froze, tray trembling in her hands as sunlight pooled across the chrome counter. All eyes turned as her fingers began to move, hesitant at first, then fluid, graceful, alive. The billionaire's deaf mother blinked, then smiled, replying in a language few in that room understood. The air thickened, the coffee machine hissed, and something unseen shifted between power and truth. Maybe the quietest people aren't the weakest after all. Follow, comment, and share if you still believe kindness can change a room. Subscribe. Now, don't miss what happens when silence finally speaks. Sunday mornings at the Crossroads Diner used to be my sanctuary. Same booth, same coffee. A quiet escape from the fallout of my ruined reputation. I was once a name in hospitality, but scandal turned it toxic, the media branding me a heartless magnate accused of discrimination. The truth was more complex, but truth doesn't trend on social media like outrage does. The bell above the door chimed, pulling me from my brooding. 2 figures entered, and the atmosphere shifted like someone had sucked the warmth from the room. The younger one moved with the calculated precision of a man who'd never known a moment's vulnerability. Colton Price, tech billionaire, 30-something wunderkind, who'd built his empire on algorithms that predicted human behavior better than humans themselves. Behind him walked an elegant woman with silver hair, her movements graceful despite her son's hand hovering possessively near her elbow. Maya Clark. My usual waitress approached their table with her characteristic nervous energy. 23, former pre-med student who'd traded her stethoscope dreams for tip money when her father's cancer treatments drained the family savings. She'd confided that to me once during a slow Tuesday shift, her hands moving unconsciously as she spoke, a habit I'd noticed but never questioned. Now those hands trembled slightly as she reached for her order pad, clearly recognizing the man whose face graced magazine covers and TED Talk thumbnails. But then, something unexpected happened. Maya's eyes locked onto the older woman, and her entire demeanor transformed. Her spine straightened, her shoulders relaxed, and her hands began to move with deliberate grace. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Maya. The window table is still available if you'd prefer the natural light." Except she didn't speak the words. She signed them, each gesture flowing into the next like a carefully choreographed dance. Evelyn Price's face illuminated with genuine surprise and delight. Her own hands rose, responding in the same silent language, and for a moment the 2 women existed in their own world of gesture and expression. The diner held its breath. Forks paused mid-air, conversations faded. Sunlight caught Evelyn's silver hair, casting a soft halo around her quiet joy. "Sit down, she's confused." Colton's voice sliced through the air with surgical precision. His hand shot out, not quite touching Maya, but invading her space enough to make her step back. "My mother doesn't need your performance. We'll take the corner booth." His eyes the same striking blue as his mother's, but cold, where hers were warm, fixed on Maya with an intensity that made my coffee cup pause halfway to my lips. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Maya's hands dropped to her sides, but I caught the flash of something in her eyes. Not fear exactly. Recognition, maybe. Like she'd seen this play before and knew her role. But Evelyn hadn't lowered her hands. She continued, signing, her movements becoming more animated, almost urgent. Maya's eyes widened as she processed the message, and she glanced nervously between mother and son. The contrast was striking, one face pleading for connection, the other demanding control. "Don't indulge her," Colton said, his tone shifting from ice to steel. "She can't hear you anyway." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I found myself gripping my coffee cup tighter. There was something wrong with that statement, something that didn't align with what I'd just witnessed. Evelyn Price hadn't simply responded to Maya's signs. She'd initiated her own conversation, her gestures too complex and nuanced to be mere mimicry. The sophistication of her language skills was evident even to my untrained eye. When Evelyn signed "no sugar" for her coffee, Colton's hand darted out like a striking snake wrapping around his mother's wrist with practiced efficiency. "Mom, we talked about this. Sugar isn't good for you." His voice maintained that concerned son timbre that probably fooled most people, but his grip told a different story. I could see the white crescents where his fingers pressed into her skin, the slight wince that flickered across her features before she composed herself. Evelyn looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her son, and something passed between them that made my chest tighten. Resignation. That's what I saw in her eyes. The kind that comes from fighting a battle you know you can't win. The morning light through the windows cast shadows that emphasized the power dynamic, his hand dark against her pale wrist. The spoon in my hand clinked against the ceramic cup, the sound abnormally loud in the tense quiet. I hadn't realized I'd been stirring my coffee for the past minute, the mechanical motion a poor substitute for the action I wanted to take. Around me, other patrons had begun to resume their conversations, but they were muted, distracted. Everyone was pretending not to watch while watching intently. The social contract of public spaces strained under the weight of witnessed injustice. Maya retreated to retrieve menus, her usual nervous energy replaced by something more purposeful. As she passed my table, I caught her eye and saw my own questions reflected there. She'd understood something in Evelyn's signs, something that had shifted her entire perspective. When she returned with the menus, she placed them carefully on the table, her movements deliberate and visible. Evelyn tracked every gesture, her eyes bright with an intelligence that her son seemed determined to deny. The way she leaned forward slightly, eager for any visual communication, spoke volumes about her isolation. The bill left behind caught my eye, printed crooked ink, smudged, but clear enough to reveal a strange code, W4. Years in hospitality made patterns hard to ignore. It wasn't a table number or an order code. I didn't write it down, but I remembered. Something about it felt important. Old printer acting up again, I muttered to myself, then caught the irony. Here I was complaining about technology while witnessing someone use their hands to bridge a communication gap that all our modern devices couldn't fill. Maya glanced over, gave a small shake of her head that could have meant anything. Agreement about the printer, or warning about something else entirely. Her expression carried layers of meaning I couldn't decipher, but the concern was clear. The moment stretched taut as Colton ordered for both himself and his mother, his words clipped and efficient. Evelyn's hands rested on the table now, but they weren't still. Her fingers traced small patterns on the worn formica, and I recognized the suppressed need to communicate. I'd seen it before in my hotels and guests whose voices had been taken by illness or circumstance. But this was different. This was a voice being deliberately silenced. The patterns she traced looked almost like letters, a secret alphabet of frustration. A movement from across the diner caught my eye. A younger customer, probably a college student, judging by the laptop and scattered textbooks, had raised her phone. Not unusual these days, everyone documented everything. But her expression was what stopped me. She wasn't taking a selfie or photographing her food. Her camera was trained on the price table, and her face wore the focused intensity of someone who recognized that they were witnessing something significant. The angle suggested she was capturing the whole scene, not just fragments. Maya returned with coffee, her movements more confident now. As she poured, she positioned herself where Evelyn could clearly see her hands. "Is everything all right, ma'am? Can I get you anything else?" She spoke the words aloud for Colton's benefit, but her hands asked a different question. Even with my limited understanding, I could recognize the difference between the spoken and signed messages. The real conversation was happening in silence right under the son's nose. Evelyn's response was quick, desperate, her signs small but emphatic. The spell broke when Colton's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, frowned, then stood abruptly. "We need to go. The driver's here." He pulled out his wallet, extracted several bills without counting, and tossed them on the table. The gesture was meant to look generous, but it felt more like hush money. As he helped his mother to her feet, his hand wrapped around her elbow with the same controlling pressure he'd used on her wrist. The way she flinched was subtle, but unmistakable. But Evelyn wasn't finished. As they moved toward the door, her free hand moved in quick, decisive gestures. Maya stood frozen, processing the message, her face cycling through surprise, understanding, and something that looked like determination. The other patrons might have missed it, might have seen only an old woman's random movements. But Maya understood. And now so did I, at least partially. The urgency in those final signs carried the weight of a drowning person's last call for help. The bell chimed again as the prices left, but the diner didn't immediately return to its normal rhythm. Conversations resumed slowly, uncertainly, as if everyone was processing what they'd witnessed but couldn't quite name. The college student lowered her phone, her thumbs already flying across the screen. The cook peered out from the kitchen, his expression curious. And Maya stood in the middle of it all, still staring at the door, her hands unconsciously forming shapes I couldn't interpret. The morning had shifted from ordinary to extraordinary in the span of minutes, leaving us all changed witnesses. I looked down at my coffee, now cold, and the partial bill with its cryptic W4 code. In my peripheral vision, I could see Maya finally moving, clearing the price table with mechanical precision. But her eyes kept drifting to the window, watching the black town car pull away from the curb. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't over. The spoon clinked against ceramic one more time as I set it down. The sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Or maybe more like an ellipsis, suggesting that this story was just beginning. The weight of unfinished business hung in the air like morning mist, refusing to dissipate. Grant sat frozen as he heard Maya whisper, "He doesn't understand me." For the first time, I realized words didn't need sound to carry weight. Monday morning brought consequences wrapped in designer suits and thinly veiled threats. I'd returned to the diner earlier than usual, nursing my third coffee by 9 a.m., when the manager emerged from his office looking like he'd swallowed broken glass. Through the kitchen window, I glimpsed a familiar figure disappearing out the back entrance. Colton Price moved through the world like he owned it, probably because he owned significant pieces of it. His presence lingered like expensive cologne, cloying and inescapable. "Everything all right, Frank?" I asked the manager as he passed my table. Frank Martinez had run the Crossroads Diner for 15 years, turning it from a highway pit stop into a community cornerstone. His hands shook slightly as he refilled my cup, unusual for a man who'd faced down everything from kitchen fires to armed robberies with stoic calm. The tremor spoke of pressure applied in places that couldn't bruise visibly. "Just business, Mr. Mercer. Nothing to worry about." But his eyes darted toward Maya, who was setting up tables for the lunch rush, and I caught the tension in his jaw. Frank had never been a good liar. It was one of the things that made his diner feel honest in a world full of corporate polish and artificial smiles. Today, that honesty was cracking under external force. The morning crowd trickled in slowly, giving me time to observe. Maya moved differently today, her usual nervous efficiency replaced by something more deliberate. She kept glancing at the corner booth where the prices had sat yesterday, and I noticed she'd placed reserved signs on both it and the window table. When a regular tried to sit there, she redirected them with unusual firmness. Her protection of those spaces felt like an act of quiet rebellion. Around 10:30, Frank called Maya into his office. Through the glass door, I could see his gestures, apologetic but firm. Maya's shoulders tensed, then dropped. When she emerged 5 minutes later, her face was carefully neutral, but her hands gave her away. They moved in quick, agitated patterns at her sides, signing to no one. Or maybe to herself, processing what had just happened in the language that came most naturally. The grammar of her distress was written in air. She approached my table with the coffee pot, though my cup was still half full. "Late shifts this week?" she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "Seems the morning crowd doesn't appreciate my communication style." The bitterness in her voice was new, sharp enough to cut. Each word carried the weight of unfairness, recognized but not yet fully processed. "Because of yesterday," I kept my voice low, aware of the other customers within earshot. The diner had ears, and gossip traveled faster than Wi-Fi here. Maya's laugh was short and humorless, a sound that belonged in boardrooms, not breakfast nooks. "Mr. Price is concerned about maintaining a certain atmosphere. Apparently my hand gestures are disruptive to the dining experience. Funny how they weren't disruptive for the past 2 years." She poured coffee with practiced precision, but I noticed the slight tremor in her grip. Frank showed me the receipt, $10,000 toward renovations. The check was post-dated with a quiet condition, maintain appropriate service standards. The manipulation was masterful in its simplicity. Not a bribe, technically. Just a generous donation with strings attached thin as spider silk but strong as steel cables. I thought of my own battles with corporate bullying, the way money could be weaponized without ever appearing violent. That's extortion. I said the words tasting like ash and truth. Maya shrugged the gesture deliberately casual. That's business? At least according to Mr. Price. He was very clear about the need for order in the community. Said something about how this town needs stability, not... She paused, her hands forming air quotes. Theatrics. The word hung between us loaded with yesterday's confrontation. The word choice made me look up sharply. It was the same term Colton had used yesterday, delivered with the same dismissive precision. But there was something else in Maya's recounting a detail that nagged at me. He said this to Frank. The distinction mattered, painting a picture of influence wielded through intermediaries. Through Frank. Mr. Price doesn't dirty his hands with direct threats. That's what lawyers and donations are for. She moved to the next table, but I caught her sleeve gently. The fabric was worn soft from countless washes, a working person's uniform that contrasted sharply with the silk and cashmere world trying to silence her. What did she say yesterday when she was signing? What did Evelyn Price tell you? The question had been burning in my mind since yesterday. Maya glanced around, checking for listeners, then leaned in slightly. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She asked if I knew medical signs, said she hasn't had an interpreter for her doctor's appointments in months. Her son handles everything. The way she emphasized handles conveyed volumes. But that's not what scared me. It was what she signed as they were leaving. Maya's eyes grew distant, replaying the moment. I waited patient despite the urgency building in my chest. Maya's eyes fixed on something beyond the diner windows, seeing yesterday's moment. She signed help, and then no voice. But she didn't mean she needed help because she has no voice. She meant... Maya struggled to translate concepts that didn't quite match between languages. She meant her voice has been taken. There's a difference in ASL between not having something and having it removed, like the difference between being born blind and being blinded. The implications settled over me like a weighted blanket. In my years running hotels, I'd encountered controlling family members before adult children who managed their parents' affairs with varying degrees of care and respect. But this felt different. This felt like silencing disguised as caregiving, a slow suffocation wrapped in concern. Grant reached for his phone as a notification buzzed. Someone had posted a video titled, "Disability Discrimination at Crossroads Diner." My stomach dropped as I recognized the scene from yesterday. But as I watched, I realized the angle was strange. The footage focused on Colton's concerned expression, his gentle touch on his mother's arm, while Maya's signing was barely visible. The caption praised him for his patience with confused service staff, who didn't understand his mother's condition. The editing was too precise to be accidental. "You need to see this." I showed Maya the video. Her face went pale, then flushed with anger. The transformation happened in seconds, professional composure, cracking to reveal raw emotion. "That's not what happened. That's not even..." She stopped, staring at the screen. "Wait, look at his mother's hands. Right there at the 15-second mark." I paused. The video expanded it. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, Evelyn's hands were moving, signing something repeatedly. Maya's breath caught. She's signing no over and over. The whole time he's playing concerned son, she's saying no. I pulled out my phone properly, this time not to take notes, but to document. The old hotel manager in me knew the value of evidence, of patterns documented and filed. I photographed the reserved sign on the window table, zooming in on the faded label beneath it. W4 was printed there, barely legible from years of cleaning solution and sunlight. Table designations that didn't match the rest of the diner's numbering system. Another anomaly in a growing pattern. "That booth has been W4 since before I started." Frank's voice made us both jump. He stood behind us, coffee pot in hand, expression unreadable. "Previous owner had some coding system for special events. Wedding parties, wakes, that sort of thing. W was for window 4 was for... well, I never did figure that out." His tone was carefully neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. But his eyes said he knew exactly what it meant now. "Window seat, 4th booth, direct line of sight to the street." Perfect for someone who communicated visually, who needed to see and be seen. Perfect for someone whose son preferred corner booths where gestures could be contained, controlled, hidden. The realization passed between us, unspoken, another secret the diner walls would keep. The lunch rush began in earnest, preventing further conversation. But I noticed things I'd missed before. The way certain elderly customers caught Maya's eye and nodded silent acknowledgement of something I didn't understand. The way she automatically positioned herself where her hands were visible when taking orders, even when she didn't sign. The careful dance of visibility and invisibility that seemed choreographed by unspoken rules. Each interaction carried layers of meaning I was only beginning to decipher. Around 1 p.m. I noticed Maya watching the street with focused intensity. Suddenly, she moved with purpose. Through the window, I saw Evelyn Price's town car idling at the corner. Not stopping, just waiting. Maya quickly signed something through the glass, her movements large and exaggerated to cover the distance. A simple phrase repeated 3 times, "I understand." The urgency in her movements suggested this wasn't the first time they'd communicated this way. The car pulled away, but not before I caught a glimpse of Evelyn's face through the tinted glass. She was crying. Or maybe that was just the distortion of the window, the way glass could bend light and truth into new shapes. But I didn't think so. Those were tears of someone who'd finally been heard, if only for a moment. Maya returned to her duties, but there was something different in her bearing now. Resolution, maybe. Or recognition of a battle larger than lost morning shifts and reduced tips. She caught my eye as she passed, and for a moment, her hands moved in a pattern I was beginning to recognize. Not sign language exactly, but the ghost of it. The muscle memory of words that wanted to be spoken but couldn't find voice. Her body carried the language even when circumstances demanded silence. The video had gained traction throughout the day. By the time I left, it had over 1,000 views and dozens of comments praising Colton Price for his devotion. Only a few questioned the narrative, pointing out inconsistencies in the editing, the strange angles, the way certain moments seemed deliberately excluded. But those voices were drowned out by the larger chorus, the one that preferred simple stories of devoted sons and difficult mothers. Truth, it seemed, was losing to a better produced lie. As I gathered my things to leave, Maya approached one more time. "She comes by every week," she said quietly. "Always trying for the window seat, always signing to anyone who might understand. And every week he finds ways to stop her. Different excuses, different tactics. But always the same result." Her voice carried the exhaustion of witnessed repetition. "What are you going to do?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Maya's jaw set with determination that reminded me of my younger self before lawsuits and public humiliation had taught me the cost of fighting systems bigger than myself. There was steel in her spine that hadn't been there yesterday. "What I've been doing. Learning. Documenting. Waiting." Her hands moved as she spoke, unconscious translation of her words into the language that had become her weapon of choice. "She taught me something yesterday. Silence isn't always about not speaking. Sometimes it's about who controls the conversation." The wisdom in those words belied her years, spoke of hard-earned understanding. I left the diner with those words echoing in my mind. Outside, I paused at the corner where the town car had idled, looking back at the window booth with its cryptic W4 designation. Through the glass, I could see Maya clearing tables, her movements efficient but watchful, always watching. The vigilance of someone who'd learned that oppression often came disguised as care. My phone buzzed again. Another notification, this time from a business news aggregator. Colton Price had just announced a major donation to the town's infrastructure fund, particularly focused on modernizing communication systems. The article praised his commitment to community development. Buried in the final paragraph was a mention of his elderly mother, described as suffering from age-related communication difficulties. The lie was so smooth it almost sounded like truth. The lies we tell become truth when repeated often enough, especially when they come wrapped in money and good intentions. I knew that better than most. But as I watched Maya through the diner window, her hands moving in silent conversation with an elderly customer who signed back with obvious relief, I wondered if some truths were too powerful to be silenced. Even by men who'd built empires on controlling the narrative. The afternoon sun caught her hands mid-sign, and for a moment they seemed to glow with possibility. Video posted by local customer online. Caption read, "She spoke with her hands. He shut her down." Colton looked straight at camera, smiled coldly. Tuesday's news cycle moved with algorithmic efficiency, and by Wednesday morning, Colton Price's PR machine had transformed a moment of human connection into a glossy narrative of filial devotion. I scrolled through article after article on my laptop at the diner, each one painting the same picture with slightly different brushstrokes. Tech Titan's tender care for aging mother. Billionaire balances innovation with family obligation. The silent struggle, one son's dedication. The headlines blurred together into a symphony of manufactured sympathy. The photos were masterfully staged. Colton guiding his mother through a charity gala, his hand protective on her elbow. Evelyn smiling at a foundation event, her elegant silver hair caught in perfect lighting. Close-up shots of their joined hands at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. But I'd learned to read photographs like hotel security footage, looking for what the frame tried to hide. In every image, Evelyn's free hand told a different story. Fingers curved inward, palm closed, the universal body language of withdrawal. Each photo was a masterclass in selective truth, showing everything except what mattered. "You see it too?" The voice startled me from my analysis. Erin Walsh, my attorney, slid into the booth across from me without invitation. That was Erin Sharp, direct, uninvited, but rarely unwelcome. She'd agreed to meet me here after I'd called about the legal implications of what I'd witnessed. Labor law wasn't criminal law, but patterns of control often crossed boundaries. Her presence brought the sharp scent of possibility and strategic thinking. "See what?" I closed my laptop, giving her my full attention. Erin had pulled me through my own legal nightmare with a combination of surgical precision and surprising compassion. If anyone could parse the legal subtleties of silencing through kindness, it was her. Her dark eyes held the focused intensity of someone who'd already begun building a case in her mind. "The way her mouth moves in this photo." She placed a printed article on the table, pointing to a seemingly innocuous charity dinner image. "My sister's deaf, has been since birth. I know the difference between a smile and a suppressed word." She traced Evelyn's lips in the photo. "She's mid-sign here. See how her mouth is shaping the word, that's not a smile. That's ASL grammar." The observation cracked open something I'd been struggling to articulate. In every photo, Evelyn's lips showed motion that didn't match the static poses. The PR team had captured her mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-plea, and labeled it as contentment. They'd photographed her voice and called it silence. "I need you to look at something else," I said, pulling out my phone. I showed her the documentation I'd started gathering, employment records Maya had carefully shared, showing her shift changes and tip reductions. The correlation between her interaction with Evelyn and her sudden demotion was too precise for coincidence. The numbers told a story of retaliation disguised as scheduling. Erin studied the information with professional interest that gradually sharpened into something more personal. "This isn't just about labor violations," she said slowly, half curious, half intrigued. "This is about systematic control. Maya's being punished for facilitating communication." She looked up at me, and I saw the lawyer's mind working behind her careful expression. "Do you know how hard it is to prove discrimination based on American Sign Language use? The ADA has gaps you could drive a truck through." Her frustration was palpable, the anger of someone who knew the law's limitations intimately. "But this isn't about the ADA," I countered. "This is about a son controlling his mother's ability to communicate. That has to violate something. Elder abuse laws, disability rights." My voice carried more hope than conviction, but I needed to believe justice had some avenue here. Erin's response came as a bitter sound between acknowledgement and regret. "You'd think so, but watch this." She pulled up her tablet, navigating to a legal database with practiced ease. "Colton Price has medical power of attorney. Filed last year after Evelyn supposedly showed signs of cognitive decline. The paperwork's airtight, signed by 2 physicians, notarized, filed in 3 jurisdictions. Each word landed like a stone in still water, ripples of implication spreading outward. My coffee turned cold as I processed this information. In my hotel days, I'd seen adult children take control of aging parents' affairs. Sometimes it was necessary, a protective measure against genuine decline. But sometimes it was something else entirely. How does a woman who can conduct complex conversations in ASL have cognitive decline? The question tasted bitter as the cold coffee. That's the beautiful trap of it, Erin said, her voice carrying professional admiration for the legal maneuvering despite her personal disgust. If she can't communicate in the standard way, if she needs interpreters who can be controlled or denied, then her competency can always be questioned. Every attempt to speak for herself can be reframed as confusion. She paused, letting the full weight of that sink in. It's elegant, really. Evil, but elegant. Through the diner window, I watched the lunch crowd begin to gather. Maya was working the late shift now, which meant the morning customers made do with servers who didn't sign. Several elderly patrons I'd grown to recognize looked disappointed, their hands moving in small abandoned gestures before settling for pointing at menu items. Communication reduced to its most basic, impersonal form. "There's more," Erin continued, her voice dropping. "I did some digging after your call. The Price Foundation has made significant donations to every major healthcare facility within 50 miles. Guess what specific departments received funding?" She didn't wait for my answer. "Audiology and speech therapy. Not sign language services. Not deaf community resources. Programs designed to restore hearing and speech." The quotation marks in her voice were audible, dripping with disdain. The pattern was becoming clear. Control disguised as care. Silencing disguised as support. I thought of Evelyn's desperate signing through the car window, her repeated, "I understand," to Maya. What must it be like to have your primary language treated as a symptom to be cured rather than a voice to be heard? The cruelty of it was breathtaking in its scope. "I want to take the case," Erin announced suddenly, her mind clearly made up. "Not just Maya's labor issue. The whole thing. There's something here, Grant. Something about the intersection of disability rights, elder care, and economic coercion that needs to be exposed." "Interesting." Her eyes blazed with the fervor of someone who'd found a cause worth fighting for. "Can you win?" The question came out harsher than I intended. But I'd learned the hard way that noble causes didn't guarantee legal victories. My own case had taught me that justice and law were distant cousins at best. The memory of my own legal defeat still stung, made me cautious about hope. "Win what?" "There's no single case here. It's a web of smaller violations that add up to something monstrous but legally ambiguous." She gathered her papers, but I could see the strategic mind already working. "But sometimes you don't need to win in court. Sometimes you just need to shift the spotlight." The smile that crossed her face then was sharp as a blade, dangerous in its confidence. "And spotlights are exactly where Mr. Price seems most comfortable." She left me with that thought and a folder of preliminary research. I spent the next hour reviewing her findings, cross-referencing them with my own observations. The Price Foundation's reach extended far beyond healthcare. Community centers that had offered ASL classes lost funding. Libraries that stocked sign language resources found their grants redirected. It was a systematic erasure of an entire language, all wrapped in the benevolent bow of charitable giving. The scope of it made my chest tight with recognition. This was how power worked, not through dramatic gestures, but through quiet strangulation of alternatives. Grant watched the light shift through the window, catching dust motes that danced like silent words. He pulled up the calendar reminder on his phone. The mayor's charity gala was Thursday evening, and according to the social pages, the Prices would be attending. Colton was scheduled to receive an award for his contributions to community communication infrastructure. The irony was sharp enough to cut, bitter enough to choke on. The light hit the schematics just right, blinding, glaring like investigative spotlights. I flagged down the server, not Maya, but her replacement, a cheerful woman who took my order without once looking at my hands. As she walked away, I found myself wondering how many conversations died in this diner now, strangled by the absence of understanding. The thought sat heavy in my stomach, indigestible as day-old coffee. The afternoon wore on, and I relocated to the library to continue research. The reference librarian, a middle-aged woman with knowing eyes, wordlessly directed me to a section I hadn't requested. There, tucked between outdated medical texts, I found a thin volume on ASL history in our state. Inside, someone had tucked a photocopied article from 5 years ago. Local woman advocates for deaf rights in healthcare. The photograph showed a younger Evelyn Price at a medical conference, her hands raised mid-sign, her face animated with passion. The contrast with recent photos was devastating, like comparing a river to a dam. This woman had been a fighter, an advocate, a voice for her community. Now she was reduced to stolen moments in diner windows, her own son's PR machine painting her as a helpless victim of age and disability. The transformation spoke of violence done slowly, methodically, with a smile. I photographed the article, adding it to my growing digital file. Evidence was building, but evidence of what Aaron was right, that no single law had been clearly broken. Yet the violation was real, as tangible as the reserved signs on diner tables and the fear in Maya's eyes. Sometimes the greatest crimes were perfectly legal. Evening approached, and I returned to the diner for dinner. The late shift was quieter, fewer families, and more solitary diners like myself. Maya moved between tables with mechanical precision, her natural warmth dimmed by exhaustion and stress. When she reached my table, I noticed new shadows under her eyes, purple bruises of sleeplessness and worry. "Any word on returning to morning shifts?" I asked quietly. She shook her head, refilling my water glass with unnecessary focus. Her movements were careful, controlled, like someone walking on ice. "Frank says maybe next month, if things settle down." Her hands made air quotes around the euphemism. Funny thing about settling down, it usually means settling for less. The wisdom in that statement hit me like cold water truth distilled to its essence. Before I could respond, she'd moved on to the next table, but she'd left something behind, a napkin with writing on it, an address I recognized as the community center, and a time. Thursday, 6 p.m. Below that, a single word, preparation. The implication sent adrenaline through my system. I pocketed the napkin, understanding. Thursday was the gala. Whatever Maya was planning, it would happen under the brightest spotlights Colton Price could arrange. There was poetry in that, using his own stage against him, but also danger. I'd learned that powerful men didn't appreciate having their narratives disrupted, especially in public. The memory of my own public humiliation was still fresh enough to sting. The diner began to empty as evening deepened. I lingered over my coffee, watching Maya work, noting the way certain customers caught her eye and nodded. A network of silent support, invisible to those who didn't know to look. The window booth sat empty, its W4 designation barely visible in the fading light. But I could imagine Evelyn, their hands moving in conversation with anyone who would listen, her voice finding shape in gesture and expression. The ghost of possibility haunted that empty space. Wednesday ended with an email from Aaron. She'd found something in the medical power of attorney paperwork, a clause that required appropriate interpretation services for medical appointments. Vague language that could mean anything or nothing, but it was a crack in the legal armor, small but real. Sometimes that's all justice needed, a crack to work its way through. I forwarded the email to Maya, adding my own note. Every voice deserves to be heard. It felt inadequate, but sometimes the attempt to understand mattered more than perfect comprehension. That's what Evelyn had been trying to show us all along. Communication wasn't about the medium. It was about the willingness to listen, to see, to acknowledge another person's humanity. As I drove home, I practiced the few signs Maya had taught me over the months. Simple things. Thank you. Please. Help. My hands felt clumsy, uncertain, like my mouth had felt when first learning English as a child. But there was something powerful in the effort, in choosing to learn a language that others were trying to erase. Each gesture was a small act of rebellion, a refusal to accept silence as the natural order. The radio played news of tomorrow's gala, breathless coverage of the guest list and charitable goals. Colton Price featured prominently, described as a visionary philanthropist. No mention of his mother. No mention of the language she spoke or the community being systematically defunded. The absence was loud as any sound. But tomorrow would be different. I could feel it building like pressure before a storm. Maya had something planned, and Aaron was building a case, and I had evidence that painted a different picture than the PR releases. The pieces were moving into place with the inexorability of justice delayed, but not denied. Erin discovered the care power of attorney document Colton controlled had strange addendum, no interpreters without prior written approval. The Riverside ballroom glittered with the kind of aggressive elegance that money could rent but never truly own. 7:30 p.m. on Thursday found me adjusting a borrowed tie in the reflection of a champagne flute, watching the city's elite perform their charitable theater. I'd purchased a standard ticket following Erin's advice to blend into the background while keeping my eyes open. The irony of attending a gala in a venue I'd once considered buying for my hotel chain wasn't lost on me. Colton Price held court near the stage, surrounded by admirers and sycophants who laughed at the right moments and nodded with practiced enthusiasm. He wore his success like custom armor, every gesture calculated to project power and benevolence in equal measure. Beside him, Evelyn sat at table W4, positioned perfectly in the spotlight's reach, her elegant navy dress a stark contrast to the animation in her eyes. Maya moved through the crowd in her server's uniform, part of the catering staff hired for the evening. I'd almost not recognized her, with her hair pulled back severely, her usual nervous energy replaced by focused determination. She carried a tray of champagne with steady hands, but I noticed how she positioned herself strategically, always within Evelyn's line of sight. The program promised speeches, awards, and a silent auction that felt too on the nose given the circumstances. I found my assigned seat among the general admission crowd, far from the spotlight, but with clear sight lines to the main stage. Around me, conversations bubbled about tax write-offs and social positioning, the casual cruelty of charity as performance art. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC's voice boomed through speakers that turned his words into echoes of themselves. "Tonight, we celebrate those who give voice to our community's needs." The phrase made me grip my champagne glass tighter. Across the room, I saw Maya pause in her service, her free hand twitching with suppressed movement. The evening opened with predictably polished speeches, community building, communication progress, hollow words. I watched Evelyn sit perfectly still, her hands unnaturally quiet in her lap, how her son's hand would occasionally touch her shoulder in warning whenever she shifted. Then came the moment we'd been waiting for. The MC announced Colton Price as the recipient of the Community Innovation Award, praising his dedication to improving how we connect and communicate. The applause was thunderous, automatic, the sound of money congratulating itself. Colton rose with practiced humility, helping his mother to her feet as if she needed assistance. They moved toward the stage together, his hand firm on her elbow, her steps measured not by frailty, but by resignation. The spotlight followed them, harsh white light that threw their shadows in sharp relief against the ballroom floor. That's when I heard it. Or rather, felt it. A vibration through the floor, rhythmic and deliberate. Someone was tapping a spoon against glass, but not in the traditional attention-getting way. This was measured, musical almost. I traced the sound to its source and found myself looking at Maya, who'd positioned herself near the central service station. The tapping continued, and gradually others joined in. Not many at first, just a few scattered through the crowd. Elderly guests mostly. A woman at table 3. A man near the bar. Service staff who'd paused in their duties. The rhythm built slowly, creating an undertone to Colton's acceptance speech that grew impossible to ignore. "Thank you for this incredible honor." Colton began, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone used to controlling narratives. "Caring for family while building the future isn't always easy, but it's a responsibility I take seriously." Behind him, the presentation screen showed images of his charitable work, carefully curated moments of generosity. That's when Maya made her move. She approached table W4 with deliberate steps, set down her tray, and faced Evelyn directly. In full view of the crowd under the unforgiving brightness of the spotlight, she signed with clear, precise movements. "Would you like to say something, ma'am?" The ballroom fell silent except for the continued rhythmic tapping. Every eye turned to Evelyn, who sat frozen for a moment that stretched like taffy. Then slowly, her hands began to rise. They trembled at first, age and emotion and perhaps fear making the initial movements uncertain. But as she continued, they grew stronger, more fluid, until she was signing with the passionate clarity I'd seen in that old newspaper photo. Maya's voice rang out, translating in real time. "My son prefers silence when he speaks, not when I speak." The words landed like a physical blow. Colton turned from the podium, his face cycling through surprise, anger, and ultimately settling on that dangerous calm that preceded corporate destruction. The spotlight, still following its programmed path, caught every micro-expression, broadcasting his loss of control to an audience trained to smell blood in the water. "This is a charity event, not a stage for disruption," Colton said, his voice maintaining that reasonable tone that made opposition seem unreasonable. "Security, please escort these disruptors out." But Evelyn wasn't finished. Her hands moved faster, now urgent with the knowledge that her time was limited. Maya translated, her voice growing stronger with each phrase. "I haven't seen my doctor alone in 8 months. Every request for an interpreter is declined. Every attempt to communicate with my community is blocked. This is not care. This is control." The security guards hesitated at the edge of the spotlight, perhaps recognizing the precariousness of forcibly removing an elderly deaf woman from a charity gala. The optics were impossible, and everyone knew it. Phones had appeared throughout the crowd, recording from dozens of angles, each one capturing a different facet of the unfolding drama. "Mother is confused," Colton said, stepping toward her with his arms outstretched in a gesture of concern. "She sometimes has episodes." "I am not confused." Maya's translation cut through his words like a blade. "I am silenced. There is a difference." The power in those words seemed to ripple through the room. I saw faces in the crowd shifting from embarrassment to understanding, from discomfort to anger. The narrative Colton had so carefully constructed was crumbling in real time, and no amount of PR could spin what we were witnessing. That's when the screen behind them changed. The prepared slideshow of Colton's achievements was replaced by a different image, a screenshot of a legal document partially redacted but clearly showing the medical power of attorney. Someone had hacked the presentation system, and I had a good idea who might have orchestrated it. "No interpreters without prior written approval." Maya read from the screen, though whether she was translating Evelyn's continued signing or reading the document was unclear. Maybe it didn't matter. "That's what my son's control looks like in writing." The room erupted, not in violence or chaos, but in something more dangerous for Colton's reputation: questions. Voices rose from the crowd demanding explanations. Several guests, who I now recognized as healthcare workers, stood up, their professional composure cracking at the implications of what they were seeing. Colton reached for the microphone, trying to regain control of his own event. "This is clearly a misunderstanding that would be better addressed in private." But the mic cut out mid-sentence. The sound system, like the visual presentation, had been commandeered. Instead, we heard a different voice, a recording of a doctor's appointment. Colton's voice, unmistakable, declining interpretation services on behalf of his mother. The audio was damning, the context clear, even without visual accompaniment. Security finally moved in, but they seemed unsure who exactly they were supposed to remove. Maya stood her ground beside Evelyn, translating a continuous stream of testimony that years of silence had built into a flood. Other servers had stopped their work entirely, some actively blocking the security team's approach with strategically placed catering carts. My phone buzzed. A text from Aaron, recording everything. "This is evidence gold." The irony was perfect. Colton Price, master of communication technology, undone by the simple act of translation. His mother's voice carried by Maya's courage, filling a room designed to celebrate his control over community dialogue. That's when I heard sirens approaching. Someone had called the police, though, for what crime wasn't clear. Disrupting a charity gala. Translating without permission. The absurdity of it all might have been funny if the stakes weren't so real. As uniforms entered the ballroom, Colton made one last attempt at narrative control. "My mother needs medical attention. She's clearly having an episode related to her condition." "My condition?" Evelyn signed, Maya translating with fierce precision, "is having a son who fears my voice more than he loves his mother." The words hung in the air like a final judgment. Around us, phones continued recording live streams, broadcasting the scene to audiences far beyond this glittering room. The police paused at the entrance, assessing a situation that didn't fit any standard protocol. That's when I stood up my spoon, joining the rhythm that had started it all. Others followed table by table until the entire room rang with the sound of metal on glass. It wasn't applause exactly, but something more primal. Recognition. Solidarity. The sound of a community refusing to be silenced. Colton stood frozen in the spotlight, his carefully constructed world crumbling with each recorded second. The award he'd come to receive lay forgotten on the podium. Security guards looked to him for direction he couldn't give, and at the center of it all, Evelyn Price continued to sign her hands, painting truth in the air for everyone to see. The police radio crackled with a report of disturbance at the Riverside Ballroom. The officer's response was telling, multiple calls about sign language. Please clarify. Even they recognized the absurdity. What crime had been committed here? What law broken? A woman had spoken in her own language. Her son had tried to silence her. The truth had won, at least for tonight. As chaos gave way to a strange kind of order, with police taking statements and guests processing what they'd witnessed, I caught Maya's eye. She looked exhausted but victorious, her hands still moving in small gestures of reassurance to Evelyn. Whatever happened next, this moment couldn't be undone. The silence had been broken publicly and irrevocably. The last thing I heard before the scene dissolved into a maze of procedures and protocols was Colton's phone ringing incessantly. The screen visible in his trembling hand showed call after call from board members, investors, PR firms. The empire built on controlling communication was facing its worst nightmare, a message it couldn't contain. Justice, I reflected, didn't always come from courts or legal victories. Sometimes it came from the simple act of translation, of making the invisible visible, of giving voice to the deliberately silenced. Tonight, in a ballroom designed for charity theater, we'd witnessed something real. And judging by the streams of data flowing from hundreds of phones, the whole world was watching. If you've ever seen power used to silence someone, tell us what happened or how you handled it. Your story might help someone tonight. Friday morning brought a media storm. Watching it engulf Colton Price from my diner booth, I felt both vindicated and uneasy. Headlines everywhere, silent no more. Billionaire accused of silencing mother, the price of control. But the real action was happening off camera. Erin had called at 6 a.m., her voice electric with legal adrenaline. We've got them, Grant. 3 healthcare workers came forward overnight. They've been documenting denied interpreter requests for months. And that's just the beginning. I nursed my coffee while scrolling through the evidence Erin had sent. Medical appointment records with telling gaps. Bills for translation services that were never actually provided, the money disappearing into administrative voids. A paper trail of systematic isolation disguised as care. Each document felt like a piece of armor being stripped away from Colton's carefully constructed image. Maya's evening shift carried new energy, vindication with tension. Frank looked tired from fielding calls, but her tables were full. People sought her out now. Around 8 p.m., Maya took her break at my table, slumping into the booth with exhaustion written in every line of her body. I knew there'd be consequences, she said without preamble, but I didn't expect them to be so comprehensive. She showed me her phone job offers, threats, interviews. The chaos was overwhelming but expected. This one's my favorite, she said with bitter humor, showing me a message that simply read, "You've ruined everything." Have you? I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective now that the immediate adrenaline had faded. Maya's hands moved restlessly, signing fragments of thoughts before she found the words. I've ruined his narrative, his control, maybe his reputation, but everything. She shook her head. Everything was already broken. I just made it visible. That's when the shift changed. A middle-aged man at table 6 had been complaining about his order, his voice growing louder with each perceived slight. Nothing unusual in food service except for what happened when Maya approached to address his concerns. "This is ridiculous," he said loudly. All this hand-waving, no wonder the order's wrong. The diner went quiet. Not the anticipatory silence of the gala, but the dangerous calm before a different kind of storm. Maya stood perfectly still, her professional smile frozen in place. I could see her hands trembling slightly at her side's muscle memory, wanting to respond in the language that had become a flashpoint. She was teaching a coworker to sign, "Thank you," said a woman filming from her booth. "If that offends you, maybe you need educating." The complaining customer's face went red, then white, as he realized he was being filmed. "This is harassment. You can't just film someone making discriminatory statements in a public place." The woman's smile was sharp. "Actually, I can. Just like you can choose to eat somewhere that doesn't value inclusive communication." What followed was a mass movement of phones rising like salutes. Half the diner was recording now, not with the chaos of the gala, but with deliberate intent. The man grabbed his jacket and stormed out, leaving his half-eaten meal and full bill behind. As the door slammed, someone started a slow clap that built into genuine applause. "People need to see this," the woman said, her fingers already flying across her phone screen. "The backlash is starting. The people who benefited from the silence are getting scared." She was right. Throughout the evening, I watched the pattern repeat in different variations. Anonymous complaints about service, sudden health code concerns, a mysterious call about suspicious activity that brought 2 patrol cars to investigate nothing. Each attempt to pressure the diner backfired as customers rallied, documented, and shared. The story was evolving beyond Colton and Evelyn Price, becoming about something larger. Erin arrived around 9, sliding into the booth with a folder that she slapped onto the table with satisfaction. Emergency POA motion filed. 3 judges fast-tracked it, Erin said, tapping the folder. "But this is what's really interesting. Look at the date on the original POA filing." I studied the paperwork, cross-referencing dates in my head. Same week she was to speak at a conference, he filed this, and donated big to the hospital's disorder wing. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about controlling an aging parent. This was about silencing an advocate whose message threatened someone's vision of how communication should work. Evelyn Price hadn't just been his mother. She'd been a powerful voice for her community, and that voice had been systematically silenced through legal manipulation and financial pressure. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number with a local area code. "Both of you, stop." Maya, reading over my shoulder, went pale. That's the same message Erin got yesterday, word for word. She pulled out her phone, showing an identical message received an hour earlier. They're escalating. Erin, ever the lawyer, was already screenshotting everything. "Good. Threats create evidence. Evidence builds cases." But I noticed she glanced toward the door more frequently, her usual confidence tempered with caution. That's when Maya opened her locker for her end-of-shift routine and found the envelope. Plain white, no postage, her name printed in block letters. Inside a single sheet of paper with typed words, "Final warning. The diner will face full health inspection Monday. Violations will be found. Closure will follow. Your choice." The threat was clear. Stop advocating for Evelyn, stop pushing the story, or lose not just her job, but the entire diner. Frank's business, the community gathering place, the safe space where sign language flourished, all of it hung in the balance. "They can't just manufacture violations," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew better. I'd seen enough corporate manipulation to know that violations could always be found if someone looked hard enough with the right motivation. "They don't have to manufacture anything," Frank said quietly. He'd approached without us noticing, his face grim. "Kitchen equipment that's been grandfathered in for decades. Accessibility features that meet old codes but not new interpretations. They'll find what they need." Maya's hand clenched and unclenched, signing emotions too complex for words. The weight of consequence was settling on all of us. It was one thing to stand up for justice in a dramatic moment. It was another to face the slow, grinding pressure of systematic retaliation. "We need more evidence," Erin said, her legal mind already strategizing. The emergency hearing is Tuesday. If we can show a pattern of retaliation, connect the threats to the POA challenge. Order, I said, suddenly the word triggering a memory. That's what Colton kept saying. This town needs order. Maya, you said he used that exact word when pressuring Frank about donations. Erin's eyes sharpened. Order. That's what tyrants call fear. She turned to Maya. We need every instance where he's used that word. Every context. Every implied threat wrapped in charitable language. As we huddled together planning our next moves, I became aware of the diner around us. Customers finishing meals, staff cleaning tables, the ordinary rhythm of evening service continuing despite the extraordinary pressures. But there was something else too. A watchfulness. People glancing our way with recognition servers moving protectively near our booth, a subtle closing of ranks. The woman who'd filmed the earlier confrontation approached our table before leaving. I've shared the video with disability rights groups in 3 states, she said quietly. You're not alone in this. People are watching. People are ready. After she left, Maya finally let her shoulders drop. I didn't think it would be this hard, she admitted. In the moment at the gala, it felt so clear. Right versus wrong. Voice versus silence. But this. She gestured at the threatening letter. This is messier. Justice always is, Erin said, but not dismissively. That's why it requires more than moments of courage. It needs sustained pressure, documentation, legal strategy, and sometimes it needs people willing to pay the price for truth. As the diner prepared to close, we made our plans. Erin would work through the night preparing for the emergency hearing. I would compile every piece of evidence we'd gathered, creating an unassailable record. And Maya would do what she'd been doing all along, translating, advocating, refusing to be silenced. But as I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the image of that envelope in Maya's locker. The precision of the threat, the calculated pressure on the diner's weakest points. Colton Price hadn't built his empire by accepting defeat. Whatever came next, it would be harder than anything we'd faced so far. I paused at my car, looking back at the diner. Through the window, I could see Maya helping close down her hands, moving in conversation with a colleague. Even now, even under threat, the language lived. That's what they were really afraid of. Not just Evelyn's voice, but what it represented. A way of being in the world that didn't require their approval or fit their definition of order. My phone lit up with another unknown number. I almost didn't answer, expecting another threat. Instead, I heard a woman's voice, elderly but strong. Mr. Mercer, I saw the news. I've been Evelyn's friend for 40 years. We need to talk about what really happened to her advocacy work, and we need to talk tonight. The plot, as they say, was thickening. But for the first time since this started, I felt the balance shifting. They might have money and power and threats. But we had truth, and we had each other. And we had a growing chorus of voices that refused to be silenced. The question was whether that would be enough. Saturday arrived, wrapped in the kind of civic tension that made the air feel electric. The town hall's parking lot filled early citizens drawn by social media coverage, an old-fashioned word of mouth to witness what the official notice had termed a public hearing regarding business compliance at Crossroads Diner. But everyone knew what this really was, a showdown between Colton Price's version of order and a community's right to communicate. I arrived at 11:30 to find the meeting room already half full. Erin had claimed space at the front, her legal materials arranged with military precision. Maya sat in the first row, flanked by other diner employees who'd come on their day off. The solidarity was visible, tangible, a wall of bodies protecting one of their own. They're scared, Erin murmured as I joined her. Look at the city officials. They know this has gone beyond a simple health code issue. She was right. The board members fidgeted with their papers, avoided eye contact, whispered anxiously among themselves. This wasn't what they'd signed up for when Colton Price started making donations. The clock struck noon, and the board chair called the meeting to order. We're here to address concerns about potential violations at the Crossroads Diner. She began, her voice carrying the stilted formality of someone reading lines they didn't write. Mr. Colton Price, as a concerned citizen and generous supporter of our community, has requested this review. Colton entered the room like he owned it, which in many ways he did. His mother followed her movements careful and controlled. They took seats at table W4 because of course they did. Even here, even now, he was controlling where she sat, what she could see. But something was different about Evelyn today. Her chin was higher, her eyes brighter. She looked like a woman who'd remembered how to fight. The initial proceedings were theater city officials going through motions of presenting concerns about the diner. Vague complaints about service disruptions. Questions about whether non-standard communication methods created safety issues. Each point was carefully worded to avoid direct discrimination while achieving the same effect. Corporate persecution disguised as bureaucratic process. Then Erin stood. "I'd like to present evidence relevant to these proceedings," she announced, her voice cutting through the administrative fog. "Evidence that these complaints are not about safety or service, but about systematic retaliation for protected speech." The board chair started to object, but Erin was already moving. She submitted document after document, building a wall of evidence that transformed the hearing from a simple compliance review into something far more serious. Medical records showing denied interpreter requests. Financial documents connecting donations to policy changes. The video from the gala playing on a screen where everyone could see Evelyn's truth laid bare. "This is irrelevant to health code violations," Colton interjected, his calm beginning to crack. "We're here to discuss whether the diner maintains proper standards." "You're here to silence opposition," I said, standing before I'd consciously decided to speak. "I'm Grant Mercer, local business owner and diner customer. I've watched this campaign of intimidation unfold in real time. This isn't about health codes. It's about a man so threatened by his mother's voice that he'll destroy a community gathering place to keep her quiet." The room stirred. People leaned in, phones rising to record. Colton's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed carefully reasonable. "My mother's health and welfare are my primary concerns. These theatrical displays." That's when it happened. Evelyn Price rose from her chair with the kind of dignity that made everyone else seem small. She walked to the front of the room, each step deliberate and measured. When she reached the podium, she turned to face the crowd, and the morning light from the tall windows fell across her like a spotlight. Her hands began to move. Maya rose to translate, but Evelyn shook her head gently. Instead, she pointed to the screen where someone had connected a laptop. Text appeared, seemingly typed in real time. "I can speak for myself." The room went silent as words filled the screen, Evelyn's hands moving in perfect synchronization with the appearing text. Someone in the audience was transcribing in real time, bridging the gap between signed and written language, technology serving communication rather than controlling it. "My son says he protects me," the words appeared. "But protection that silences is not protection, it is prison. For 8 months, I have been denied interpreters at medical appointments. My attempts to communicate with my community have been blocked. My voice in my own healthcare has been removed." Colton started to rise, his face flushed with anger, but froze as cameras turned toward him. The optics were impossible, interrupting his deaf mother as she testified about being silenced. He sank back into his chair, trapped by his own public image. "I am not confused," Evelyn continued, her signs growing more emphatic. "I am not incompetent. I am deaf. That is not a disorder to be cured or a problem to be managed. It is who I am, and I have the right to communicate in my own language." The transcription continued, each sentence building the case that Erin had started. But this was more powerful than any legal argument. This was lived experience, delivered directly from the source they'd tried to silence. No interpretation needed beyond the bridge of technology. No filter between Evelyn's truth and her audience. "The diner welcomed me," she signed. "Maya saw me not as a problem, but as a person. She spoke my language when my own son refuses to learn it, and now she faces punishment for the crime of translation. This is not order. This is oppression." A movement in the back caught my eye. A man in an expensive suit had stood up, speaking quietly into his phone. He gathered his papers and headed for the exit, his departure followed by 2 others. I recognized them from the financial papers as Colton's investors. The rats were beginning to leave the sinking ship. "My son built his fortune on communication technology." Evelyn continued, seemingly unaware of the corporate exodus beginning behind her. But he fears the most human form of communication, the language of hands and heart. He has used his wealth to silence not just me, but our entire community. ASL programs defunded, interpreters discouraged, a systematic erasure of our voice. The board members were shifting uncomfortably now, realizing they were presiding over something far bigger than a health code hearing. One of them leaned over to whisper urgently to the chair, gesturing at the cameras, the crowd, the growing energy in the room. That's when Maya approached the podium. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside Evelyn in solidarity. Then slowly, she began to sign. No translation this time, just pure ASL, her movements flowing like water. Around the room, others began to stand. The elderly man from table 3 at the diner. The woman who'd filmed the confrontation. Healthcare workers, teachers, teenagers, and retirees. One by one, they raised their hands and began to sign the same phrase, "We hear you." It didn't matter that many signed imperfectly, that some simply moved their hands in approximation. What mattered was the attempt, the recognition, the refusal to let Evelyn stand alone. The room filled with moving hands, a silent chorus that spoke louder than any words. Colton's phone rang, the sound jarringly artificial in the organic moment. He looked at the screen and paled. Another call immediately followed, then another. The empire built on controlling communication was facing its worst nightmare, a message spreading beyond his reach. "I move to table this hearing indefinitely," one board member suddenly announced. "It's clear that the issues at hand require more consideration than a simple compliance review can provide." "Seconded," another member quickly added. "All in favor." The vote was unanimous, board members eager to extract themselves from a situation that had spiraled beyond their control. But Evelyn wasn't finished. As the official portion concluded, she signed one more message, translated now by dozens of voices reading the screen. "This is not over. This is beginning." Grant felt the words resonate in his chest. Justice wasn't a shout. It was a trembling hand lifted in truth, multiplied by every other hand that rose to meet it. The aftermath was controlled chaos. Reporters swarmed Evelyn, but she pointed them to Maya, the translator who'd risked everything to give her voice. Erin handled questions with her usual precision, while Colton sat frozen, his story collapsing in real time. "Mr. Price," a reporter called. "Any comment?" He looked up, fear flickered, then vanished behind corporate poise. "My legal team will be in touch," he said, walking out like a man pretending he wasn't fleeing. As the crowd thinned, I stood with Maya and Evelyn. Her eyes shone with relief, not sorrow. She signed to Maya, then to me. "Thank you," I replied with the only phrase I knew. "No. Thank you." The room emptied, but the energy lingered. Something had shifted. This town had found its voice again. As we prepared to leave, I noticed the W4 marker move to the podium where Evelyn had stood, a symbol of silence turned into a monument of truth. Outside, sunlight stretched across the square as small groups lingered, practicing new signs, retelling what they'd witnessed. The story was no longer just online. It was becoming memory. Erin met me by the car, exhaustion cracking her usual composure. "3 investors just pulled out," she said. "Colton's empire is bleeding. Dynasty. We make it permanent." Evelyn gets her voice back. Watching them sign beneath the fading light, I realized this wasn't about one diner, but about the right to be heard and how silence enforced is violence enacted. Tuesday's hearing sealed it. Judge Martinez ruled that denying communication violated human dignity. Evelyn Price regained full autonomy. Outside, supporters celebrated as Maya translated for reporters. Justice rarely ends neatly, but it had spoken. Within days, the Attorney General launched an inquiry into deaf patient discrimination. The Price Foundation's donations turned to evidence, and Evelyn's case sparked a national conversation on dignity and communication. Maya returned to morning shifts. The diner thrived, people came to belong. She'd found her voice by giving others theirs. "Funny how things change," Frank said. 6 months ago, I feared closing. Now we're a model just for treating people as people. That evening, Evelyn returned driving herself. The crowd applauded, but she waved them off. "I just came for pie." At her old seat, table W4, she typed with a smile. Around 8, one of Colton's aides arrived and left behind company papers. Whistleblower Aaron murmured. The next morning, I wrote my own piece. I once lost everything for standing up to power. Watching this town stand together reminded me that losing everything is sometimes how we find what truly matters: connection, courage, and the will to translate truth into action. By Friday, the diner felt alive again. Maya was teaching co-workers sign language. What began as solidarity now simply made sense. A week later, the place overflowed with laughter as teens taught elders and kids showed parents how to sign "I love you." Evelyn watched from her window seat, free at last, while I received a text from my daughter, "Proud of you for using your voice again." Maybe that was victory, not headlines, but connection. That night, I found a package on my porch. A leather-bound ASL book inscribed, "For Grant, who knows silence isn't golden when it's forced." Inside was the sign for justice, 2 hands steady and resolute. Tomorrow, coffee would brew, stories would return. And by the window, a woman with silver hair would speak in a language no one could silence. Justice was served quietly through courage, truth, and human connection.